Immaculate is written by Andrew Lobel and directed by Michael Mohan, and tells the story of Sister Cecilia, a nun who's been invited to a convent in the Italian countryside. But things soon take a turn, and Cecilia slowly uncovers a dark secret hidden within the sacred walls. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. This movie wasn't really on my radar in all honesty. I didn't even know it was out yet or that it was playing in theaters at all, so it was just a very spur of the moment thing where I was looking for something to do with a day off work and decided to go check it out, having seen none of the marketing material and doing zero research on what kind of movie this was or what the reception looked like. It feels like every couple of months for the last little while we've had a movie focused on a young woman in a convent or some similarly religious context. Hell, The First Omen is out in a couple of weeks, so we're going back in for some more very soon. Immaculate's poster and premise had me thinking I had a fairly good idea of what I was in for, but I'll eat my hat on this one because this movie surprised the hell out of me in a few ways. Main two things that really caught me off guard were the insane reveals in the narrative when we start getting a better idea of what's going down, but I also wasn't expecting to see just how far this movie was willing to push into some really disturbing material. How the hell this is 14A is beyond me. Like, what would it take to make this 18A? How much more do you need? It does take a little while to really get going, and for a fair chunk of this one, I was thinking that it would sort of just be another generic religious horror movie with all the tropes you've come to expect, and there is a bit of that earlier on, but once the wheels are turning, this movie has a lot to offer. Honestly, one of the more compelling opening scenes in a movie this year. It was actually pretty indicative of what to expect from the movie going forward, because when I started it, I thought I knew where this opening scene was going, and then things get pushed further than I thought they would, and by the time the title card came up and the really nice eerie music kicked in, I had a big stupid grin on my face. One thing that Immaculate loves to make you do is sit in certain moments for way longer than you probably want to. The camera will just linger on something happening to someone and you keep thinking it'll cut away, but it just doesn't, and it makes you soak in every detail and all of the expressions on their face. You really feel like you're trapped in these moments. It happens a few times and it's done very effectively to create this great sense of discomfort with moments that absolutely should elicit that feeling. There were a handful of moments where I was either caught off guard by just how gruesome something was, or was genuinely cringing at shots that I really wanted the movie to cut away from. The movie does a very good job with that kind of thing, and it made me even happier to see the focus be on really good practical effects, which is something that isn't always a guarantee with this kind of movie. Usually you'll see a lot of CGI used in this sort of setting, so their commitment to doing things practically was very welcomed. Some of the effects in Immaculate are like genuinely impressive. I wasn't expecting to see this sort of thing here. To clarify though, it doesn't rely entirely on cringeworthy violence or gore to get its point across, because a lot of what made this movie effective was the way the narrative was handled and the situations that Sister Cecilia finds herself in. There are some ideas presented in this story that I found to be so interesting, with a ton of potential for really cool directions, and overall, I feel like they pulled it off. Cecilia gets dealt, well, a pretty unfortunate hand, let's say, throughout the movie, and watching her navigate the increasingly dark hellscape she's caught up in was so much fun, because you really wind up rooting heavily for her as you watch her become more and more resourceful. She's really quick on her feet, which resulted in some fun action scenes that I wasn't expecting in something like this. It gets pretty damn raw at times, and when the gloves come off, this movie really doesn't hold back. If Cecilia realizes she needs to do something, she's gonna do it in whatever way she can, and sometimes that means doing some gnarly shit. She's badass, and it was fun to follow along and watch her take things into her own hands and do what had to be done. I also adored the setting for this movie. This sort of countryside is such a good setting for this kind of horror, and especially once the story starts to be revealed a bit more, the sense of isolation becomes so much more tangible. They make great use of the scenery a few times, and the location of the convent itself has a really strong sense of history to it. I'm really drawn to this sort of aesthetic, and seeing it utilized as well as it was here, it was great. I appreciate that they chose to shoot on film as well, because digital cinematography doesn't fit this aesthetic nearly as well, in my opinion, and the lighting seemed so thoroughly thought out and worked to build up the atmosphere, which goes a long way for me, you know this. So I did have a really good time with this movie, but it's not without its issues. I'd say my biggest problem with Immaculate is that while Sydney Sweeney is really great during the scenes when she's like just letting loose and exploding with emotion, whether it be anger or fear or whatever, she expresses those strong emotions really well. But during the more subdued scenes, I found the performance to be a little flat. That could be that she was simply playing the role of a nun, which does tend to be more of a closed-off personality, but because it takes a while before she really starts going off, the first act of the movie sometimes dragged because it was a little tough to get invested in her character with how flat her scenes were. In all honesty, that's not just an issue with the lead. I found most of the side characters to be pretty uninteresting. They're mostly there as fairly one-dimensional characters to help move the story along, but it would have been nice to feel a bit more attachment to some of the others to carry through the first act of the movie. There is some character development going on with them, but it sort of feels like it's just there because you have to have some amount of backstory to your characters, and it doesn't necessarily serve the overall story or your connection to it very well. At least my connection. I shouldn't speak for you. What it boils down to is that this feels like the sort of movie that was born of a really cool idea, and then they built an entire story around that one idea and focused on placing characters in their necessary positions to let that play out instead of using the characters to create a stronger connection between the audience and the movie. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, especially once you get further into things and the story gets batshit insane with some really disturbing moments and stressful sequences, but aside from Cecilia's engaging problem-solving and resourcefulness, I didn't really find myself connecting with the world that was being presented here. There is a little bit of like Bond villain monologue feel to some of it, which was a little irritating, but again, the stuff around that was enjoyable enough that it didn't kill the experience. Without spoiling anything, the movie's ending is fucking wild. And as soon as the credits rolled, the few people that were in the theater, we just started looking at each other and sort of laughing, you know, like, what the fuck did we just watch sort of way? That was really fun. I will say, fair warning, this movie pushes things pretty damn far. As someone who watches horror movies all the time, there were a few moments where I was taken aback by what was happening on screen. Nothing is sacred, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like the most disturbing thing I've ever seen, but I just feel like it's good to mention that it does push things. It's also a nice, tight, like 94-minute runtime, which felt perfect for this. Often, these kinds of religious horror movies will try to push more towards the 2-hour runtime, and they can really start to drag towards the end. So I was very glad that this was tight. This felt like a good runtime for this story. That worked really well. Immaculate is out in theaters now, and I don't have any problems recommending it. It's not a perfect movie by any means. It's got some issues with thin characterization and some somewhat flat performances at times, but the core idea of this narrative and the gloves-off approach they took really made for a fun watch that I was not at all expecting. It's got some good creepy imagery, the atmosphere is good, I really liked the music. Yeah, I enjoyed the movie quite a bit, and I always respect when a movie can catch me off guard and push into unexpected territory. I left the theater in a great mood, definitely feeling the impact of what I just watched. This is easily one of the best religious horror movies we've had in a while, and thankfully it leans into its strengths more than enough to keep the weaknesses from bringing it all down too much. It's a really good time. If you haven't yet, consider giving it a watch, and if you have seen it already, please share your thoughts down below because I'm really curious to hear what the consensus is on this one. Alright, you know what's next? Blood and Honey 2, baby. I'm hopefully seeing it on Tuesday night, and if I can do that, I'm gonna try to get a video out on Wednesday, and I'm praying this movie's a step up. It's gotta be, right? There's no way that this isn't better than the first one. We'll find out for a few more days, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.